Hello and welcome to the Neuroeducation podcast with Angie Dee. Thank you for listening in. Today we're going to be diving into the topic of how sitting is the new smoking and what we can do to get our children moving. There was a recent publication that looked at 13 different studies, and these studies were comparing the negative health effects of sitting to smoking. And the findings were shocking. They found that sitting for up to 8 hours a day was comparable to the negative effects that smoking has, which we know affects a much greater risk of heart disease and cancer. So when we take this into account and we look at our children in schools, children are in school for up to 6, sometimes 7 hours a day, and predominantly, they are sitting at tables and chairs, working for the majority of that time. On average, children in Australia get about a 1 hour movement break with recess and lunch. However, we also have a variety of studies that have different estimates. But one of the estimates that come out of the USA from Kaiser was showing that children aged 8 to 18 are on screens for over 7 hours a day. And in Australia, even younger children were for at least 2 hours a day sitting or lying down watching screens. So if we take into account the amount of time they're sitting at school and then the amount of time they're sitting on watching screens, TV, iPads, phones, whatever it may be, we are looking at something that's very comparable to the study showing 8 hours of sitting a day being comparative to the negative health effects of smoking. What can we do about this? How can we change this? Obviously, screen time is up to parents, and obviously parents have a lot of pressure on their work schedule, and there's many things that come into play. However, what we can do is look at schools and how much time children are sitting during their academic learning time. Over the last 2 years, I have frequented about 20 different schools through Queensland, Australia. Now, what I saw in those schools were children predominantly sitting for almost every lesson. It was very rare that children were taken out for outdoor lessons or there was a lot of movement involved. Sometimes children are engaged in learning rotations where there is some movement between activities and more hands-on learning, maybe with maths rotations. However, the majority of other learning time, especially in the upper years after prep and grade 1, the majority of that learning is done on a chair at a table, and they're sitting for the entire learning time. And different schools have different expectations for what is appropriate for children. There are a lot of schools that are incorporating things like brain breaks, which I think is absolutely fantastic. And they're instituting more brain breaks, which involve movement, because of the neuroscience is showing how imperative for movement to get brains back online. And interestingly, there was one school that I went to, and 10 o'clock every morning, the entire school went out onto the oval for about a 20-minute movement break. And I was fascinated because I hadn't seen this happen school-wide at any other school that I had been to. I had seen this happen in some classrooms where I know that some teachers had a whole class brain break, but I'd never seen an entire school do this every day without fail. And so I asked some of the teachers and I said, why are you doing this whole school movement break? And what they said was, well, there's no way that the children can focus for that long during a morning session. You know, from whatever it is, 8:30 until 10:30 or 11 o'clock when their first morning recess is. It's not possible for children to focus that long. So of course, we need to break that up and give them a good movement break in the middle. And all the teachers that I asked at this school said something similar. And yet, interestingly enough, when I talked to other teachers at other schools, how they felt about doing a brain break, and I told them what I had seen at this school, many of them said, yeah, definitely it's good for children, but it's really hard and sometimes they get distracted. You know, it's hard to get them back on focus and all of these things. However, the teachers at this school had seen such a positive effect of this mid-morning session brain movement break that they had now been doing it for years and they couldn't imagine not doing it. And this is interesting because this really brings up the topic of the culture of the school, because whatever school that you're at and whatever you've been doing, the principal promotes, whatever other teachers are promoting, and what's been happening often comes over time a standard practice. But that standard practice creates a culture. And so what I think is really important is if we look at what is actually happening in Australia, in America, and around the world, we have a crisis. We really have a crisis on our hand. Children sitting for this many hours a day and not being active is literally damaging their health. Yes, we can't see it right here and right now, but we know that smoking drastically affects your chances of getting cancer, heart disease, cardiac failure, all of these things. And the Educator Australia showed that children aged 5 to 14, only a quarter of them were getting their recommended 1 hour physical activity. So that means even when they are having playtime, let's say at school, they're not moving physically. A lot of children going to the library or just sitting down and talking, and they're not getting that movement break. Then they're getting home and they're getting on screen. So we really have to change this. Promoting more physical activity at school. I would definitely be one of those schools that is promoting children not to be in the library on screen time, especially first and second break, because there are some schools that do allow that, and these children need to be moving. We can make moving more engaging. The benefits of movement for children are so many and varied. And there was an incredible study done through the University of South Australia, and they looked at 50 different schools that had been incorporating more nature play. And what they found is over 90% of teachers said they saw a benefit, not only in their mental well-being, their emotional well-being, but also incredibly in their academic performance. What this goes to show is really an example of what neuroscience backs up how movement switches on the brain, not just for their emotional benefit, but also it is so beneficial for their academic intelligence and their academic capabilities. So we can integrate more nature play into the academic learning time, more hands-on learning. And I know there are many teachers that through standard of practice, through a tradition of how it's always being done, that the majority of the learning is done in a chair at a table and it is sedentary. However, I would challenge teachers and schools to start to shift this so that more learning is done through moving and through doing. Montessori schools have been doing this for over a century. Maria Montessori, the Italian educator, created a style of education through trial and error as a doctor, also as a scientist, to see how children learnt best. How were they the most engaged in their learning? And she saw that movement was key to them learning, being free to move around the classroom, being free to engage in their hands-on learning activities, and also to engage with their peers. Social intelligence and social learning goes hand in hand. I talk a lot about how much learning integration and recall is done through the learning pyramid and some of the other studies on learning retention. And what we find is that being able to talk to a peer or work in pairs really maximizes the child's learning retention. So think about movement, not as a distraction and not just as a brain break or a movement break, but movement as being truly integral to learning. I really hope this encourages you as a parent or a teacher to get out of the classroom. Yes, movement breaks, yes, brain breaks, but also thinking about how we can integrate learning into action. Thank you so much for listening. Please let me know in the comments what you got out of this episode, and if you have any other great ideas or suggestions or what you're doing at your school or with your children, homeschooling, let us know. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe or follow us on any of the social media platforms, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and if you can share this message with one of your friends, teachers, parents, that would mean so much for me, so we can really make a change for children to be able to get them more active.